Hello everybody, how's it going today? Glowplasma231 here, back in to talk about Kagurabachi, chapter number 70. This chapter is titled Iai White Purity Style. And honestly, after last chapter of Kagurabachi, I honestly did not know where we would be focusing on next in the greater Kagurabachi manga. Of course, as we will be talking about here in a minute on what happened last time in Kagurabachi, we saw the whole sort of awakening, I guess is what we will say in quotation marks, with Iori after Ikora came and pretty much pretty much had a key in his hand to be able to seal Iori and all that stuff, even though I don't really think it's going to be relevant at this point in time, because like Iori has like awakened as her duty, or not really even her duty. I've been reading too much other manga to where it's like, hey, this is your destiny and your duty, and Kagurabachi really doesn't seem to have any of that yet. I'm going to say yet because that is a very easy trope for any animated manga sort of do. It's like, hey, this is your destiny, which has been preordained already. And honestly, whenever I think of, like, some of the really big manga out there, mainly the big three, I guess, like, you could add Dragon Ball and, like, a few other really big shonen manga to that. Like, hey, it's the big three. It's Naruto, it's One Piece, and it's Bleach. And, like I said, Dragon Ball, or maybe, like, Yu Yu Hakusho, Hunter x Hunter, or, like, a few of these other bigger shonen series. A lot of them have this roll tie of, like, hey, this is what our destiny is. And, like, honestly, One Piece doesn't really have a whole lot of that. I mean, of course, we do have the Will of D in One Piece and sort of how that builds up and what it really means, but Naruto, I'm honestly not that big of a fan of Naruto in the way that, like, I can think about, like, oh, hey, where's all of the destiny? Where's all that other various stuff going on in there, right? So I can't really say how much of a destiny or how much of a role that destiny plays in Naruto's story. But Bleach is, of course, my favorite of the big three and one of my favorite manga series of all time. I don't know how Tite Kubo ended up coming up with that, but he did, and it was incredibly amazing, like, every second that I read it. And thinking back to that series, there was a good amount of Destiny stuff. Also, some spoilers for Bleach here if you guys have not read that manga. And if you haven't, finish watching this chapter review. That'd be pretty cool. And then you could go check out the manga or anime, whatever you want to do. I mean, I watched the entire anime first, and then I read the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, and I've gone back and read select parts of the manga and all that various stuff. You know, maybe I need to sit down and do a complete reread of Bleach or something here soon. Who really knows? But that's all to say, like, hey, Bleach has a few of that tie of, like, hey, this is your destiny, Ichigo. I mean, you're an amalgamation of literally everything put together. So it's like, your destiny was to be doing all of this, and all of that to say that Iori, I don't know if she's going to be doing that same sort of destiny thing, or if that's employed at Takeru Hokuzono is going to be using it at some point, being that, like, hey, that's not really where the story has been built up so far. But really, with all of that talk about, like, destiny and how I didn't know where this chapter is going, and however long I've rambled about this, like I said, this chapter is called Iai White Purity Stocks. Of course, we focus on the Iai White Purity style technique, and we get a lot of really cool details, and honestly, just a super cinematic chapter of Kagurabachi. I mean, there's really no other way I could, like, describe this chapter besides for being absolute cinema. But of course, before we hop into this chapter of Kagurabachi, like I said, chapter number 70, we first need to talk about what happened last time in Kagurabachi. And well, we had this chapter really focusing in on Ikora, who is, of course, Iori's classmate. And in the whole process of that, we pretty much had the whole events where, like, hey, Ikora was going after Chihiro and mainly also after Iori. He ended up in the Kyoto Bloodshed Hotel through a bunch of other random events, and while ever Chihiro was fighting Hiruhiko, there's eventually this moment where Ikora comes up and, like, he scrunches his hand and the blood sort of pulls in it, and then he uses that to draw what I am dubbing the Scar of Salvation on his face. Again, that comes from Bleach's Horn of Salvation is what my best guess of where I came up with that name. But with all of that various stuff out of the way, eventually, we see that Chihiro goes and gives Ikora the key to pretty much seal up Iori's memories, even though, like I said, I don't know if that's going to be, like, a major play that we are going to be doing now. And eventually, Ikora makes it upstairs, and, like, all of these other exorcists are getting ready to attack him. Not exorcists, golly, I've also been reading way too much Twin Star Exorcists, or maybe a video on that soon, but I just read, like, 7 chapters before reading this, so, like, no. All of these sword people, members of the Hishaku, they're not exorcists. Golly, Corbin, what am I doing? What is Glowplasma devolving into in this episode, right? Where was I? Ikora is getting ready to be attacked by a bunch of different sorcerers. And at that point, we see that Iori awakens her powers, and she's holding a sword, and pretty much what seems to be the EI stance, and as we'll learn much later in this chapter, yes, it is the EI White Purity style stance. And all of that to be saying, yes, Iori has awakened her powers. And no, we don't start this chapter really in that same moment. And we honestly don't touch on the whole moment of like, hey, here's Iori with all of her swords and all of this protecting Ikora. We will see a little bit of that at the very end of the chapter, but it will take us a brief moment to get there. But we actually start off this chapter of Kagurabachi on the ground floor of the Kyoto Bloodshed Hotel, where we see that, of course, Chihiro and Hiruhiko are currently facing off with each other. And we can sort of tell this is the direct moment after Ikora had left and went upstairs to go and deliver the key to Iori, right? As we see that Hiruhiko sort of saying here, just being like, oh, well, Chihiro, apparently you have a plan to help that girl escape, don't you? As Hiruhiko thinks back to whenever Chihiro's like, hey, kid, take this key up to the roof and you'll find Iori. Like, hey, it's the key to bring Iori back. Like, I also found it really funny to, like, it is literally not only the key to bring Iori back, is like, hey, the key implement, but also it is just a literal key. I didn't really touch on that last episode, if I'm not mistaken. Granted, it was like 2 weeks ago that I filmed the last Kagurabachi chapter review, but all of that out of the way, right? And Hiruhiko pretty much just is like, hey, and when you make it that obvious, Chihiro, I have to go, don't I? As you see that Hiruhiko is standing here in the moment, we see that he's got his arm outstretched and that he is furiously pressing the elevator button to get it to go upright. And Chihiro's like, hey, I won't let you. As we see that Chihiro gets ready with an EI White Purity style in his hand and leans forward and completely rockets straight into Hiruhiko, right? As Chihiro just thinks like, damn it, it's not enough. As like Hiruhiko comes up, has another blade, like starts to parry him. As we get the chapter title of this chapter again, Chapter 70, EI White Purity style, right? As we get a bunch of narration here for the next, honestly, like a few pages of this chapter, where we pretty much get all of the explanation of the EI White Purity style, right? So we start off all of this narration just saying like, hey, Swordmaster Itsuo Shiraki reasoned that fastest equals the strongest. And to achieve that speed, he developed these EI White Purity style stances. Shiraki maintained these stances produced the fastest propulsion towards the enemy, making it possible to slash a sword while moving at a maximum velocity. And as we're sort of getting this narration on the EI technique, we actually cut to Itsuo Shiraki speaking for himself, as he just says like, ha ha ha. Everybody laughed at me at the time. As you get a little bit more narration just saying like, hey, not without reason, normally the foundation of all swordplay and EI is maintaining a strong grip on the sword so as to harness all of the build-up power. Of course, we see a little bit of a diagram where a guy's sort of holding a sword in his hand and raising it above his head and then swinging it beside him while saying a good old hiya. But of course, like, hey, the blade is imbued with kata energy and it is a good and stable way to pretty much hold the sword is what it's getting across. And then we get a little bit more of an explanation like, hey, and that's why the katana is held like this. The knuckles at the head of the metacarpals are aligned with the blade's edge. This is common sense since it allows the fire transition straight from drawing the sword into an attack. As you pretty much understand like, hey, whenever you are holding a sword with the blade facing down, you normally want to do a reverse grip on the blade. So of course, like, hey, whenever you pull the sword out of the sheath, the blade is actively facing towards your enemies, right? But as we get more understanding like, hey, but the White Purity stance is an orthodox. After drawing, the sword fighter has to rotate the blade 180 degrees before it reaches its target. So of course you are holding the sword with the normal grip and then you have to rotate it to use the EI White Purity style, right? And at this point, we get a lot of sort of ideas that were being thrown around at Itsuo Shiraki a long time ago, right? As we see a bunch of these other like sword masters and people just saying like, haha, so right after drawing the sword you have to like re-grip it, like you'll disrupt all of the spirit energy you build up. And like, hey, the whole premise of that stance like yields the high speed makes no absolute sense whatsoever. Like, you can get extremely fast if you perfect the standard drawing technique. That's like the smart approach to doing it. Like, hey, this idiot wants to waste energy on unnecessary movement, right? And then we also cut back to Itsuo Shiraki. He just says like, hey, and in the end, none of those guys who laughed at me lasted. because I cut them all down. And man, we get a really good look of what Itsuo Shiraki looks like in this moment. And man, he's got such an interesting character design, along with like this other various like explanation to his story of like, hey, he just proved to everybody that he was simply better than the rest of them. And this is like a really cool moment to come out and have and be like, hey, this is who this guy really is. And like, hey, everybody may have laughed at him for his funny sword drawing technique, but in the end, he was the one who got the last laugh. It's some pretty good and funny stuff, right? At this point, we cut away from this, and we see Ro and Chihiro sort of talking to each other in the Kyoto Bloodshed Hotel. Of course, they are currently in the Pine Room, and we see that Chihiro is breathing very heavily, right? As we just see this, like, and he's like, rats, like, I still can't seem to get the hang of this, right? And Ro's like, hey, I mean, what's the problem, Chihiro, right? And Chihiro's like, hey, well, hey, I'm losing both speed and force whenever I'm using the EI style because of the very awkward grip, right? And we see that Rose is like, I mean, yeah, that is the classic drawback of the White Purity style at the end of the day, right? And he's like, hey, nearly all sword fighters charge up their katana with their spirit energy, and they have to concentrate to do that. And normally when you add complex movement like regripping, you lose focus and all of the spirit energy then disperses, right? So you have to be able to use this sword as a natural extension of your body, in a way that doesn't require extra awareness. You have to use spirit energy to merge with your katana. And he's like, hey, I know it sounds really simple, but it requires extreme intuition. Like, honestly, you have to be a complete freak to pull it off. And like, hey, that's why only 3 men have ever mastered the EI White Purity style. And of course, we know these 3 men to be, of course, Yoji Iruha, who is now in the grave. Poor old Iruha. Like, man, I can't believe Iruha is actually dead. Honestly, I still want Iruha to come back as like a zombie at some point and be like, oh my god, that's crazy, right? But of course, we have Itsuo Shiraki, and of course, as we all know, Seiichi Samura, all being the only ones who have really mastered the EI White Purity style, right? And Chihiro then just says, like, after Rose says all this various stuff, she says, like, hey, merging with the katana, huh? I mean, I've been seeking up... And he's like, hey, merging with the katana, huh? I mean, I've been seeking up with the sword using spirit energy, so I kind of get what you mean. As of course, we remember, like, hey, yes, Chihiro is the wielder of the enchanted blade Inten, so with all of that sort of stuff being completely said, he knows how all this sort of just works, right? As Chihiro just thinks, like, hey, just a bit more, if I can just get it to click. As at this moment, we cut back to the massive battle between both Hiruhiko and Chihiro, as we see the 2 of them are getting ready to just, like, do even bigger of a showdown in this instant, right? And as we cut into this, we see that Hiruhiko is getting ready to come towards Chihiro with a massive sword strike as they're holding their sword behind them in their right hand. And all of a sudden, we see that the sword just completely disappears. We cut over to Hiruhiko's right hand, we cut over to Hiruhiko's left hand, where we see that Hiruhiko tries to go and re-grab the sword, but wait a second, it doesn't come from there. So we see that Hiruhiko ends up reaching over and grabs the sword from their left hand again, but on the right side of their body, and comes through and goes to hit Chihiro with the sword, right? And Chihiro just thinks like, damn, this guy can re-grip the sword like so freely without using any force whatsoever, right? As we remember to what the student of a general manager, Yojiro Sengoku, said, like, hey, that guy was clearly an amateur, right? As you get a little bit of a narration explaining Hiruhiko's background, it's like, hey, a wild animal. Hiruhiko killed a man for the first time at the tender age of 3. He bit to death a full-grown man who was assaulting him. And let me quickly just say, like, this was definitely toned down in the Viz translation. In the Japanese translation, it specifically says that it was a man who was sexually assaulting Hiruhiko, and that was the reason that Hiruhiko... I mean, of course, we knew that Hiruhiko was probably going to kill this guy anyway, but that was sort of like a detail that was sort of left out. It was actually a sexual assault that happened and not just like regular, just like assaulting him, like beating him over the head with like a baseball bat or something. It was something a bit more worse and a bit more scary, all things considered, right? And the narration just continues saying, like, hey, fighting is his way of life. Using spirit energy is like breathing for him almost. It transcends consciousness and enters the realm of pure instinct. Those survival instincts, hand in hand with Hiruhiko's unorthodox fighting style, gave birth to an extremely innate and unconstrained sword technique. As we just get like the ideas of like, hey, pure impulse and pure instinct. That is the sword technique that Hiruhiko uses as the student of freedom, right? So we see that Hiruhiko comes through, swinging their sword back and forth and ends up clinging swords with Chihiro, right? Chihiro, like, is able to block it just barely, right? And we see that Hiruhiko's like, damn it, like, this guy can visually follow all of my unorthodox movements. Like, what's going on here, right? As we see that Chihiro is also just thinking like, hey, even if Hiruhiko has innate advantages, I was endowed with special gifts too. There's no reason I can't beat him. I have my way. As we see that Chihiro gets ready to sheave up the sword again, of course, to use the Iai white purity style, right? And we see that Hiruhiko in a moment is just like, oh, so you're doing that kata thing again. Like, hey, you guys are just idiots. Like, all this tradition stuff is like, man, it's just a load of crap, all things considered, right? As we see that Hiruhiko comes through and ends up putting the blade back in the sheath also, and gripping the sword in a regular underhand grip. As we see that they have the Iai white purity style grip in their hands. As Hiruhiko's like, oh, so, like this, as we see that they get ready and they use the Iai white purity style and sort of come forward and swing into Chihiro. So he's like, damn it, like the white purity style, like, hey, it's not perfect, but it's an incredible imitation, right? As we see that Chihiro is knocked on his back by this movement, right? And the elevator finally dings and Hiruhiko starts to walk in it, right? And Hiruhiko's like, oh, well, looks like I better prioritize the girl. And she was like, hey, no, wait. As we also see that another elevator opens its doors, as we see again the student of General Manager Yojiro Sengoku is sort of just staying here on the ground. He's like, hey, Chihiro, this way, right? As we see that as Chihiro gets into his elevator, the door on Hiruhiko's elevator starts to close. As Hiruhiko just is like, oh, Chihiro, I'll see you up there. As we see that now, both Chihiro and Hiruhiko are waiting in the elevators, waiting to get up to the top floor, the rooftop of the Kyoto Bloodshed Hotel. And while standing in the elevators, we get some different narration from both of them. They just like think about all of the various things going on here, right? Chihira's like, hey, don't panic. We've lived different lives. Like, I have my own way. We see that Hiruhiko's like, hey, it's like a magic trick. It only works the first time that you use it. Things would have been easy if I could have just taken out an arm, but it won't work on him now. As Chihiro just thinks like, hey, visualize the method of the regrip. As he's like, hey, this is what I need to do to succeed. As Hiruhiko also just thinks like, hey, I get the gist of what's going on here. To kill this guy, I need overwhelming speed, not trickery. As you see that that's what Hiruhiko's vision to end up killing Chihiro is, right? As we see both of the elevators ding and the doors start to open. And as the doors start to open, Chihiro just thinks to himself one more time, the example. As he just thinks to seeing Samura use the Iai style, his one cloudy and hazy memory of this style being used. As we see both of the elevator doors start to open, Hiruhiko is standing at one, Chihiro is standing at the other. Both of them are holding their swords in the Iai white purity style grip. As all of a sudden, both of them start to lunge at each other and use the Iai white purity style technique. We see that as these doors open, it is the exact moment where Iori had just come through and protected Ikora from all of the other sorcerers coming to harm him, right? So like I said, this is when all of our various timelines all come and merge together, right? As we start to get some narration, faced with a boundless fighting talent, sensed impending depth. As we see that Chihiro sort of looks at all of this stuff going on and sees the image of Iori protecting Ikora as he is lunging towards Hiruhiko, right? And we get the idea of course, Iori's something of like, hey, I want to protect my life at school. And like, the narration continues saying like, hey, the means to fulfill that desire was alive inside of her. The memories of her original power, the seal that made her forget, came rushing back in that moment. And we see that Chihiro sort of just sees this like, wait, how does she know how to use a katana? And Chihiro just sort of internalizes all of this as the narration continues, saying like, hey, in a fleeting life or death moment, Chihiro's mind goes completely quiet and he simply watches. Her sword technique isn't directed to kill. Like a precision machine, she simply trims away the hostility directed her away. As you see that as Iori is using the Iai White Purity style and all of her various sword techniques, she's not actually killing any of these people. What she is actively doing is cutting off their fingers so that they are no longer able to use a katana and thus no longer able to fully come through and harm her anymore, which is just like a really cool way to sort of portray all of this, right? The narration continues to say like, hey, delicate and precise. Even without that deadly speed, her movements are imbued with the white purity style of Seiichi Samura's technique. The hazy example becomes crystal clear. As we see the way that Iori is holding the sword in this moment, her middle finger and her thumb are really the only two gripping the blade, as her pinky finger is completely extended, and her ring and, what is the other finger? The pointer finger. Those two fingers are the ones that are still there and sort of like curled up into a ball almost, right? As we see, as this happens, Chihiro understands what he's been missing in the Iai White Purity style, and as the two of them are lunging towards each other, Chihiro and Hiruhiko both clamor their sword blades on each other, sort of just using their ultimate techniques, as we see that Chihiro comes through and ends up not only breaking Hiruhiko's sword completely in half, but also dealing a massive wound to Hiruhiko. And as this happens, we see that Chihiro sort of like opens his eyes and is like, wow, I actually did that. As he looks over towards Iori, as the narration just says, and then she knows everything. And that is where we end this chapter of Kagurabachi. Like I said, an incredibly cinematic chapter with Iori finally realizing everything that's been going on here and like pretty much everything about herself, who her father is, all this stuff, like she knows how to use a sword, and all of it sort of comes rushing back towards Iori in this moment. It's not only a really cool thing to see of Chihiro coming through and completely cutting down Hiruhiko, but also this really cool display of like, hey, Iori finally knows everything, and like it's just a really awesome chapter we have here of Kagurabachi. Really, there's just like a lot of awesome things we have, like not only the beginning of the chapter focusing on Itsuo Shiraki and all of his various stuff, and like, hey, how everybody laughed at him for his stupid little sword technique, but in the end, it was one of the best and most powerful sword techniques out there that really none of them would have even been able to master because of how weird and how much it's sort of related to it, right? It's a really sort of cool moment in that respect. And also, the whole build up to the whole thing of like, hey, Chihiro is learning how to use the White Purity style. He has this very hazy example that he doesn't really fully understand. And at the end of the chapter, seeing Iori use the Iai White Purity style sort of brings Chihiro back to his senses, where he sort of comes in and fully understands the gravity of the situation. It's just honestly really incredibly cool to see. Like, honestly, a great chapter of Kagurabachi we have, and honestly, there's not really much else for me to say. Like, I just love how Iori isn't strictly a murderer. She is strictly just going through and harming all of the people's hands like they can't use their swords again. Really cool moment we have there, along with all of the various stuff like, hey, Chihiro and Hiruhiko sort of fighting with each other, and eventually Chihiro ends up coming out on top. And no, I don't think this is the death of Hiruhiko. I definitely think that Hiruhiko has a lot more time in the engine. I mean, they're definitely seeming to be built up as one of the bigger bad antagonists, because of course they are contracted to Kumayori, so like I would think they'd be coming back and doing more soon, unless like they just die here and like Kumayori goes to like Talo or one of the other various Sashaku members. Hey, maybe Kumayori will end up going to Toto or something random like that. But like I said, really awesome chapter of Kagurabachi. And hey, I hope you guys enjoyed this chapter review of chapter number 70 of Kagurabachi. Again, this chapter was indeed titled Iai White Purity Style. And if you did enjoy it, well, thank you very much for watching. I know this video has been a little bit of a rambly video. It definitely not the video I intended to record for this chapter, because I feel like I didn't really get across. So it'll definitely depend on how well I edit this video, being that, like, I've probably been recording this video for 10 minutes longer, if not 20 minutes longer, than the recording implies, just because I've been flubbing all of the various lines and all that other stuff. But hey, either way, thank you guys so much for watching this Kagurabachi review. If you did enjoy this review, I've got plenty of others just like it on the channel. Go check out the Glowplasma channel. I'll have the Kagurabachi chapter reviews playlist, not only listed in the description box down below, but also on the end card of this video, so you guys can just go and check it out there. But yeah, with all that out of the way, thank you guys so very much for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time for Kagurabachi chapter number 71. Again, this was chapter number 70, titled EI White Purity Style and Bachi Bros. I'll be catching you guys next time. This is Glowplasma 231, signing out.